Hello everyone. Uh, this is Shafiqur Rahman from Brain. We are having a show today where we have invited very distinguished guest Razib Khan. He's a Bangladeshi American who has been living in America since he was, I think, 4 or 5. So he's more American than Bangladeshi, but of course, by genetic, he is fully Bangladeshi. So Rajiv Khan is one of the most famous Bangladeshi people in the media and science popularization in Substack, in all these kind of media. Rajiv's Substack is one of the very popular Substacks in the internet, subscribed by many, and it's followed by a lot of people. If you have followed Rajiv Khan, you would know that the world's some of the world's most distinguished names in archaeology, in history, in AI, and in lot other fields in his lot other field have conversed with Rajiv regularly, joined with him in his podcast, and talked with him. And Rajiv also has interacted with them, with many of the thought leaders in genetics, AI, history, those who are household names for those who are the field expert for 20 or more years. So he's quite he's like almost what the frontier state of knowledge in these fields are. So he's quite very much aware of them, and he expresses them to the public very lucidly and very nicely. That's why he has a very large following. So today we have invited Rajiv to specifically ask question about genetics of the Bangladeshi people. It's not about just genetics, but also the history, because as it happens in the last 20 years, genetics and history has become intermingled. We cannot. History of a people is directly history of the genetic structure of these people. So without going further, let me ask Rajiv a basic primer question. So Rajiv, when we hear that Bangladeshi people are descendant from 10 or 15% Indo-European, about 30%, something like that. I'm just putting out the ballpark figure. 30% ancestral South Indian and other thing. How do we get that? So how is the population structure of a people is determined that it's descendant from this person here, that person there? Can you talk us briefly about that?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways that you can think about this sort of question. One simple way is obviously just look at how a population is related to other populations in the world. So it's very, very you can use other populations as reference populations and then use those populations to figure out the combination in your target population. So classical example would be African Americans, Black Americans in the United States. And the way that people often talk about them is, oh, well, they are 80% West African, 20% Northern European. What that basically means is if you look at the genomes in the aggregate of a bunch of African Americans, this is the average. There's variation across individuals, obviously, from individual to individual. You get an average about their genetic variation. About 20% of it is like Europeans, Northern Europeans in particular, and about 80% of it is like West Africans. We happen to know the history of African Americans, American descendants of slaves, whatever you want to call them. And so it's very, very easy to interpret this statistic because it's a statistic, right? You have 3 billion base pairs in your genome, about 4.5 million variations from the reference genome in that base pair. That's the raw variation that you're looking at. You have, X million number of overlap according to X, this population to that population. So you're looking at these abstruse statistics, and then the statistics are being summarized in a way that shows you how the variation breaks out in relation to your reference population. So you have reference populations and then you have a target population. So that's a very easy way to interpret it. And it can be very straightforward when it comes to something like African Americans, whose history in ethnogenesis goes back 300 to 400 years. And we have a fair amount of historical evidence, of textual evidence of how that came about, right? So when it comes to population genetics with African Americans, all we're doing is getting the point estimate and basically some further details. Like, for example, we can figure out that most of the European admixture in the African American genomes dates to before 1800. And this aligns with certain scholars of slavery that basically most African American ancestry dates to the 17th and 18th century, and let's say the slaves that came before 1814 and all that, they didn't have very much of an impact. Okay, so that's like kind of figuring out details based on history we already know. Another case, and this is more relevant to South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, whatever you want to call it, is there's a lot of blank spots in our historical knowledge, and so we can do the simple thing that I just mentioned to you. And so when I first got a 23andMe result, I can tell you in 2009. No, spring of 2010. I actually remember where I was. So spring of 2010, 23andMe result comes back and it says I'm 55% Asian and 45% European. Okay, so the reason it said that is because there are 3 reference populations in 23andMe in 2010. There's Africans. This is really a Yoruba population from Nigeria. There's Europeans. This is mostly a sample of whites from Utah that are mostly English with some German ancestry. And then Asians are Chinese. So what that's saying is, like, if you look at my genome and you have Chinese, Northern Europeans, and West Africans, I look like I'm about 55% Chinese and 45% European. Okay. I think you understand that that's hard to parse. But that's because, you're giving the data, you're giving the algorithm only a finite amount of data, and then you can interpret it however you want, right? So obviously that's not correct, but it is informative. What it was informative immediately is my genome has more Asian ancestry, actually, than most South Asians. I knew that. There wasn't that much. 1,000 genomes wasn't out. We didn't have the Bangladesh samples. There was some microsatellite work, which is kind of a primitive form of genetic assay. There was some microsatellite work. There was, and like also, if you just look at Bengalis in particular, you can kind of tell that some of them look East Asian. I wasn't surprised that my genome was more than 50% East Asian. Most Indian subcontinental people were getting results that were more like 40%, 45%, Asian. Okay. So I was more Asian than them. What did that immediately tell me? It just told me, like, okay, like, if you look at Bengalis and look at the proximity, have more East Asian ancestry. That was my suspicion. That was confirmed years later when they updated the algorithm, right? They updated the algorithm. So today, if you actually look at 23andMe, and I'm going to use 23andMe as an example because they have the longest track record, Ancestry and others have different track records. It says I'm basically 99% Bengali. Okay. And so what that means is they're taking samples from mostly Bangladesh, but I think that the 23andMe actually added some West Bengali samples, but mostly Bangladesh initially, because that's where the data initially came out of. And they're seeing how I fit within the range of Bengalis. Okay. And I'm perfectly within the range of like the 99th percentile or whatever of Bengalis. Right. So that's how they're estimating, but that's not telling you anything about the history in detail that you don't really know. And there's a lot of models, there's a lot of scenarios that fit that outcome. Right. So, you have to think about time. So these admixture plots, these summary statistics, these comparisons between all these different populations, one way you have to think about it is they are the terminal branches. They're the end point of a historical process. And that historical process you can imagine as a graph. It used to be people imagine as a phylogenetic tree, but really it's more like a graph. It's more like a lattice. And there's admixture gene flows across different nodes, across these population histories. So populations are splitting, we're leaving Africa, and then they're mixing again, and they're splitting, and they're mixing again. And there's many, many alternative scenarios that modern population variation can fit. Okay, it's really hard to distinguish. What started happening, let's say like 2009 with David Reich's paper, David Reich and Nick Patterson and their group's paper reconstructing Indian population history, is they started using, this was before ancient DNA, but they started using models that posit more complex population structure to explain let's say to explain not necessarily outliers, but like details and nuances in the variation that are hard to fit in the more simple models. So the simple models, very like 20, 25 years ago, with the earliest genomic, primitive genomic data with microsatellites and some SNP arrays, is that South Asians fall between East Asians and West Asians and Europeans, right? Actually, you saw this in Cavalli Forza's work with classical alleles, like in the 1990s. And so the easiest way to explain it is like, oh, well, they're in between, or they're a mix of East Asians and Western Eurasians, right? And that kind of fits the data, but basically, that's not the truth. I mean, we know it's not the truth because we have more data. Okay, so the data that the Reich lab used initially was using Andaman Islanders as an outgroup, as another reference population. When you add that, all of a sudden, the statistical fit is much better. And so what that was immediately telling us in 2009 is that South Asians, their ancestry that drags them more towards East Asians is not East Asian itself, but it is indigenous probably to Southern Asia. And these Southern Asians are a sister population to Northeast Asians. And the Andaman Islanders are one of the relics populations, one of the remnant populations of that. There are no pure representatives of these Southern Asians alive today that we have, really. And so you have to use other populations that split off from them to try to reconstruct the model. So the way you can imagine it is there's a graph, and you're filling in the graph with the populations that you have, but there are all these blank spots, and you're trying to infer the directionality of the admixtures and the topology of the remainder of the graph. The last thing I want to mention is the emergence of ancient DNA. So what ancient DNA does, it fills in gaps in the position of the graph, fills in gaps. And let's say you have a statistical model and there's 5 different alternative models that statistical model could fit. And like basically these are alternative graph topologies. Okay. When you have ancient DNA can collapse that from say 5 to 2. Because it automatically eliminates some options because, well, you have the real result. You're not inferring the ancient DNA now. You have the ancient DNA. You have the ancient population. So now you can like select a subset of the model. So what ancient DNA does is it basically prunes your space of possible models for the real models based on, in that time period, you have DNA. And so what was we don't have like any pure so the term is for the indigenous South Asians, that are more related to East Asians. They call them ancient ancestral was it AASI, right? Ancient Ancestral South Indians, or they call them, Aboriginal South Asians, Aboriginal, South Asian foragers, whatever. There's a bunch of terms. I'll just use AASI because it's just easier, but don't take the term literally. I think it's a little confusing actually. But so that population, we don't have any pure ancestral exemplars of that population, but we actually have, kind of close ancestral exemplars for the West Eurasian component of Indian subcontinental ancestry, right? And that's people from, kind of greater Iran is what I would say. Greater Iran, kind of like, Transoxiana into Afghanistan, whatever, maybe the margins of Pakistan, but also, Iran proper itself. And then obviously, a component that's related to the Indo-Aryans, whose origins seem quite clearly to be from the region between the Dnieper and the Don, probably, dating to let's say 5,000 years ago, right? And so those are like the 3 primary components. But in the original 2009 paper, Reich and Patterson immediately. So basically, there's a West Eurasian, East Eurasian, right? There's an Ancestral North Indian, Ancestral South Indian was the original term that they used. Klein, which means that all South Asian populations can be like modeled as a linear combination of these two, right? These are the 2 contributors, except for some. Okay, and these are populations that are off Klein. Bengalis are one population that's off Klein because a minority, like when you look at the line, Bengalis are shifted over. Okay, and they're shifted over toward East Asians. And so there's an East Asian admixture into Bengali. So when you look at the statistical models that have support, they often have 3 ancestral populations. So they have steppe is one of the terms that they use. So this is for the Indo-Aryans. They use Indus Valley Civilization, IVC, which is, that's pretty straightforward. What that is like the, greater Pan-Iranian population. And these are, the term Iran is from Aryan, but these are pre-Aryan Iranians. Okay, so it's a little confusing, just to be clear for the listener and the viewer out there. And then you have the AASI, you have the indigenous foragers that are additionally related to the Andamanese. And those models fit with over 90% of ethnographic groups in South Asia, right? They don't fit with Bengalis, they don't fit with Assamese, they don't fit with Munda tribal people. They also don't fit with the Balachis, but that's because Balachis have more like West Asian. They have more West Asian ancestry that's different from the Pan-Iranian, the pre-Aryan Iranian one, So these populations are off decline when you do a principal component analysis, which visualizes the genetic variation. But also, if you do an explicit model that tests like contributions from ancient populations, you don't get a good statistical fit with Bengalis unless you add East Asian. So you have to add complication. So, in science, you try to be parsimonious. You have a minimum amount of explanatory variables that can explain the data well. Well, if you don't include East Asians, the data for Bengalis is not, it's not explaining their variation. So you got to include East Asians. And so it turns out, depending on what type of Bengali, your Bengalis are between about 5 to 20%. About 5 to 20% East Asian. Okay, that's the range that I've seen. Okay, that's not true. I have seen someone from Chittagong who is 25%. Okay, but let's say like within like 99th percentile, I've seen probably like 3 or 4% for some Bengali Brahmins, and then like 20% for people that are from far eastern Bengal. Bangladesh, like I think the result usually that you get out of the 1,000 genomes is like between 10 to 15%. And then the West Bengal samples that I've seen, they're more in the 5 to 10% range. But, I have gotten samples from people who are, West Bengali, but then they also tell me, oh, but my family are Hindus from East Bengal, and their results are actually higher East Asian ancestry.
Another molecular geneticist and evolutionary geneticist, and he's also a science popularizer. He does video recording and also writes posts about science, and is quite popular in Bangladesh. Like he's a science explainer like you, but though he mostly does it in Bengali. And Hasib Bhai, we already introduced to you before. So Shamol or Hasib Bhai, whoever, any of you want to go first?
Yeah, I feel like one kind of like quick follow-up would be, first of all, I think that was like a masterful overview of kind of our knowledge of how we infer population histories, especially as it relates to the subcontinent or South Asia. I guess like a useful point for like our listeners would be, could you focus on some of the landmark papers that kind of led to all of this knowledge? You highlighted the 2009 Rack and Patterson paper. And is that where like most of our knowledge comes from, or are you also working in the more recent papers in the field as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, so when it comes to the methods have been around for a while. So let's go back to 2000, Pritchard et al. So the classical structure paper. If anybody really wants to understand how model-based clustering, so when you see the bar plots, when you see a bar plot with a lot of percentages, that's really where that all starts. Before that, it was mostly principal component analysis, and you had also like maps that like tried to project the PCA like that. Kawali Ford said in the 90s. No one really followed up on that. Anyway, so it's mostly principal component analysis, which basically is just a visualization of the dominant components of variation within the data on a geometric chart, Cartesian chart, 2-dimensional. Sometimes they try 3-dimensional, but like I don't know how that works unless you want to see a hologram. But in any case, so 2000 model-based clustering with the structure algorithm, which was followed up by various other algorithms that are kind of similar. And then there's so that's like the early methods paper, and then I think Patterson et al. Let me just see the early F statistics paper. I think that's 2012. So that's ancient admixture in human history. So a lot of this is driven by ancient admixture, human history, and genetics. This is a very, very methods-oriented paper, November 2012, and it introduces F statistics, which is kind of the basis for a lot of the admixture, QP, admin. That's kind of the stuff you'll see people posting on the internet. And the difference between okay, I want to be like clear here. So, these sorts of analyses that break ancestry into different parts, they all are informative and they're obviously real science, but you see all these different percentages, and that's because, well, you can set up the model in different ways, and the goal is to set up a model that reflects the real history, but it's not going to 100% reflect the real history, right? And it's dependent on the various methods, that various data that you have. So 2009 Reich's paper on South Asian genetics, on Indian genetics, was only possible because one, you had the data, you had the sampling of subcontinental peoples, and then you had genome-wide data. So in the 1990s, you had like 50, 100 markers, and you use those variables to try to get population structure. In a coarse way, you could kind of recapitulate the major, geographical groups. But with the genomic era, you have millions and millions of potential variants. Practically, you only analyze a subset of these. I think the 2009 paper is like less than 100,000, but that's still a lot of variables compared to the past, right? Now, you're going to hundreds of thousands of markers. So the 2018 Vagish Narasimhan's paper.
2019, I believe.
Is it 2019? Okay, yeah. So that paper used a SNP capture array, I believe. And so that's got hundreds of thousands of variables. But I think the major thing with that paper is the ancient DNA, right? And with the ancient DNA, it's like, we've gone from a point where we didn't have a whole genome of any human beings 26 years ago to whole genomes of Neanderthals that are hundreds of thousands of years gone, right? So we have a lot more data, and so this is like a combination between the methods and the data. In a way, the methods they've always potentially been around, like some of you will know, like theoretical population genetics was pretty well developed in the 70s and 80s, but it didn't have much data to work with. The data shows up, and so like all sorts of methods that were lying around have been leveraged, and so I would focus on like the 2012 paper with the F statistics, Pritchard's 2000 paper, and with principal component analysis, I think most people understand. I mean, that's just like a general method in the social and life sciences that's often used to reduce genetic variation. I guess like Priya Murjani's paper for the South Asian perspective, Priya Murjani's paper from 2014. On Indians is 2013. This is a follow-up of okay, so actually there's a bunch of them, but like I think Priya's paper from 2013 on Indians is a follow-up on the 2009 paper and adds more populations and more time depth. Then there's Vagish's paper in 2019. I think that and it was combined with another paper that looked more focused on a woman from the Indus Valley civilization. They're published together a lot. Since then, honestly, like ancient DNA has not really progressed that much in India. No one knows why. We can speculate why, but no one knows why. We can speculate why. But there has been like more whole genomes coming out. Contemporary populations. The 1000 genomes paper has some. The 2015 1000 genomes paper has Bangladeshi samples, I think, by then. And so there you can start to see some information on Bangladeshis that's very, very fine grained. And basically, the government of India is just extremely backwards, and the permit Raj stuff means that you don't get that much data out of India, and so you have a lot of data out of Bangladesh and Pakistan because no one cares there about whatever they care about in India. And so actually, for the first since the Human Genome Diversity Project in the 1990s, like most South Asian genetics understanding in the population genetic sphere was Pakistan, because you have like a bunch of samples out of Pakistan, and then eventually you get these Bangladeshis, and you can actually see by the there's a little bit of population structure, and I can get into that later in the Bangladeshi sample, and you can see that population structure is geographically distributed in a way, because if you look at the IDs are definitely people collected at the same location at the same time sequentially. And you can see that like there's a sequence of IDs that have a particular population structure. They're not related though, but they were clearly collected at the same clinic. So they must be from some community that's in Dhaka that's quite distinct from everybody else. Okay, and we can talk about that later. So you see, I've looked at this data pretty closely, actually. So what happened with the Indian samples, by the way, in the 1000 genome is they didn't collect them in India. Well, they have some Sri Lanka Tamil samples, and the Telugus they collected in Birmingham. And so now, like as we're recording, there's some Indian consortium papers that just came out, like literally the last couple of days. It's pretty good, but this is 2026. There's really no reason aside from red tape that this had to take this long. That has retarded the development of like the analysis of some of these questions, because you can't really understand Bangladesh genetics without India subcontinental genetics, right? And the ancient DNA is just way delayed. Nobody knows why, or no one has a direct explanation of why. But you have like way more genetic understanding of like a small province of China than the whole Indian subcontinent, because of the delay. So that's what's happening there.
So I would let Hasib Bhai ask question next. But before that, I just want to set up the place by asking population. Bangladeshi population is a little bit distinctive in the South Asian population, and the main two ways I think, from a layman's perspective, that you mentioned, that number one is the eastern admixture that you mentioned previously. Another part is that lacking of structure. You mentioned that the South Asian population, India and also in Pakistan, is highly structured. That reflects like hundreds and thousands of years of endogamy and not much social mobility and other places. But in Bangladesh, it's a little bit different. Can you talk about a little bit how is the Bangladeshi population bit distinctive in the South Asian population?
Yeah, it is a bit distinctive because, so, when you look at like East Asians or South or Europeans populations, when you do a principal component analysis, which is just projecting, you often see, at a certain granularity. So let's say I sample, I don't know, like a bunch of people from East Anglia, okay, in England, or a bunch of people from Anhui in China, Anhui. Okay. What you'll see is, like, usually when you try to do the principal component analysis, you see this like cloud, and the cloud is because people are just randomly scattering kind of all over the place because there's not much population structure. Yes, people are genetically different, but it's just because there's just like a lot of random variation among unrelated peoples in a particular locality. When you go to the Indian subcontinent, what you often see is, these lines, and the lines represent clines, and they represent poles of different populations and admixtural proportions. So if I go to, I don't know, a village in Tamil Nadu, probably, you're going to see, I'm going to see like 3 clusters probably immediately. One cluster will be if there are Brahmins in the population. Another cluster will be Dalits, and the third cluster will be everybody else, the dominant cluster. Even with everyone else, there's going to be variation, but I'm just, give a stylized fact. And so that's what, and this was initially shocking, actually. The amount of endogamy that exists in the Indian population is not actually expected by Western anthropologists, because people should have higher exogamy rates just randomly, but they obviously don't. There were, when the initial data came in, I know for a fact that like people double check their analyses because these just like seemed an unreasonable amount of endogamy. Okay, but that's just how it is. When the results started coming in from Pakistan, Pakistan is obviously a Muslim country. There's no caste system, but you see the exact same pattern. And to this day, there's some samples from Lahore. There's an incredible amount of structure in these samples. Like the variation is like, some of these Lahori individuals, there's a large numbers of people. These are not just random people. They look more like South Indians. A lot of the Lahori individuals look like standard Northwest, but these are all people just sampled from Lahore. And nobody knows, like, there's Birdari, but like they didn't really collect more ethnographic data. So we don't know what the structure is due to, but it's clearly, within there. There's some, English analyses of Pakistanis in Britain, and they show the correlation between genetics and Birdari, and also like whether you're, Gujar or whatever, like all of these like ethnic groups, not ethno-linguistic, but socio-ethnic groups. I can say that in Pakistan, they're basically equivalent to caste in India, which is Hindu, right? So that's within expectation. When they sample the Bangladeshis, these are mostly Saletis, but this is also true in the 1,000 genomes. When they sample the Bangladeshi, so there's a group in Cambridge with Hilary Martin and her PhD students. They actually called me because they're like, this is weird. They don't look like other South Asian populations that we have. They don't look like the Indians. They don't look like the Pakistanis. They look like a European or East Asian population with a big blob. Okay. And that basically means that there's not that much population structure. There's not that much consanguinity. There's not the Pakistan populations have a lot of inbreeding. Some of the Indian populations do too. South Indians also do cousin marriage. But in any case, there's not that much inbreeding, and there's not that much population structure. Partly it's because they were getting Saletis, but even when you look at Bangladesh itself, it's a very, very straightforward structure of like, people in the far west, maybe in Kushtia or something by West Bengal have less East Asian ancestry. People where my family is from in Kumilla have more East Asian ancestry. We're right by Tripura, right? But that's really straightforward and expected. There doesn't seem to be that much structure of, there's this community and that community, and they might live in the same village, but they don't intermarry. So it's not a South Asian pattern. It's more a standard human pattern, right? And this was a little surprising after what people had seen in the South Asians. I will say there is within the 1,000 genomes Bangladesh samples, like there's like a half a dozen individuals that are very distinct from everybody else in the sample because they have almost no East Asian ancestry. Like every other individual has non-trivial East Asian ancestry. And then they have almost no East Asian ancestry. They look more like South Indians. I don't know who they are, but they were collected at the same location because their IDs tend to be right next to each other in the 1,000 genomes. I don't know who they are. No one's ever told me. But there is a small minority of people in Bangladesh that don't have East Asian, well, at least in Dhaka, that were sampled by the 1,000 genomes that don't have East Asian ancestry. And some people have told me, well, they might have been they might have been agricultural workers that came from South India during the colonial period. Whatever it is, they're not intermarrying with the other Bangladeshis, and they have zero East Asian ancestry, which is strongly indicative that they're not Bengali at all. Because even among West Bengalis, you tend to see East Asian ancestry, which is pretty rare outside the further west and south you go. Like obviously Assamese is different, they're like Bengalis that way. But anyway.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to be clear, in case like a lot of people many of the audience don't know, endogamy means like marrying within your group. So so it seems that the caste system is more rather than more professional or otherwise, it has been perpetuated by very strict social rules of not marrying outside your group. Because as you know from genetics, even if in a generation about 1% or 2% people married outside, then after several centuries, the structures become a lot less prominent. So the high structure in the South Asian population means that people practice endogamy quite seriously here for the hundreds, thousands of years.
Yeah.
So
let me just so the name of the paper, Murjani paper 2013, is Genetic Evidence for Recent Population Mixture in India. And that's the one that really highlights the caste structure, by the way, that it shows that caste, Jati really, is because it's not just caste, because like the different Brahmin populations don't seem to be particularly closely related, for example, across the subcontinent. So Jati Varna is thousands of years old in the subcontinent, right? And that paper, Genetic Evidence for Recent Population Mixture in India, Priya Murjani 2013, American Journal of Human Genetics, that's the one you need to look at. But just go on. I mean, Vankish's paper later also shows some of that.
So Hasib Bhai, it's time for you. Like, you have a lot of questions. Where do you want to start?
Well, just because Murjani paper was mentioned, one of the things that I found weird is in Murjani papers, all these different uh, tribes were noted and Muslims were treated as one tribe. So I didn't understand how that could be. But my question is, you mentioned something about the Klein and ANI, and ancient North Indian and ancient South Indian, and you have said that in Bangladesh we see the East Asian genome. So maybe a triangle kind of a thing. So is there a plot anywhere that sort of
Yeah.
is in these three? And I'm sure that Rajiv, when I've read I used to member of your Substack. I remember that, or I felt that you have also researched a lot of other genome of Bangladeshis, not in that. So what
Yeah.
what is
I have some people have sent me things and with like better provenance, right? So in terms of like I know where they're from because they told me, right? So that was the issue with the 1,000 genomes. It's just in Dhaka, right? So
okay? My one of the observation that I had, that there was a paper published by ICDDRB. They did some research. I don't know, maybe from the 1,000 Genome Project, and they had a fascinating story to tell. That they identified that Bangladeshi Bengalis have been a sort of a unique set of people since the 5th century AD. So 1,500 years, it has sort of diverged from other population. So, what would be your take on what happened 1,500 years ago that sort of it has
yeah.
remained in a cluster?
Yeah, actually,
What?
so yeah, so nobody knows, honestly, but I've replicated that finding, and so I'll tell you guys real quickly like what that finding is from. So when you have an admixture between two populations in the genome, the segments in your genome, the length of the ancestral segments reflect how far in the past the ancestry is, right? And it's an exponential decay. And so you can fit it to that model and then infer from that how far in the past the admixture happened. So with African Americans, for example, they have very, very long, well, they have a distribution of ranges due to recombination. They have a distribution of ranges of segment lengths, but there's some very long segment lengths. And that's because some of the admixture happened as recently as 8 generations ago, okay? And so if the admixture happens in a finite amount of time, you'll see a distribution of segment lengths of like the minority ancestry, for example, based on time since the past. So the parameter is like how many generations in the model since the past, and you can infer. When you look at the Bangladeshi genome, you see a pattern where it dates to about 500 AD. This was like, I thought it was kind of weird when they found this out. Like this was initially just detected in the 1,000 genomes data. I mean, it's been replicated many times. I've replicated it. Like I've used the same method and I've replicated it in the Bangladeshi genomes I have. It actually includes West Bengalis as well. So it's not just Bangladeshis, it's Bengalis overall. Because we didn't have any data from West Bengalis, you couldn't test it. But it's the exact same time. So this was like a common population of Bengalis. There was a paper on Assam that came out a couple of months ago, and I think that they had about the same date. So something happened in the northeastern part of the Indian subcontinent around 500 AD. And, I thought when I first saw the result, like, oh, this seems like a little too clean of a result. But, I've replicated it very, very robustly myself when I looked at the data. And other people have replicated in like, okay, now we have it replicated in West Bengalis. And it's the exact same signal as you see in the Bangladesh population. And the Assamese, like, they have somewhat more East Asian ancestry, but it probably the Assami, like, okay, so the Aham are the Thai-speaking population that arrived after 1000 AD. They added a later layer, but it looks like the Assamese have a base layer that is the same as the Bengalis. Okay, so there was an Indo-Aryan speaking population in the northeastern part of the subcontinent that around 500 AD mixed with a substantially East Asian population. And, it happened in a short period of time. And, the original analyses were like, oh, maybe this was like Tibetan expansion. Nobody really knows. There's not that much, like, a lot of the stuff that we have history of Bengal during that period are references in Tibetan annals. And so obviously it's going to be biased towards that. When you look at the ancestry, my initial hypothesis of what this ancestry was, it was Austroasiatic, so similar to the Munda people. It doesn't look like, in the Bangladesh samples, it's not like that. And in most of the West Bengali samples, it's not like that. In some of the West Bengali samples, it is Munda ancestry, but if you look at where the Munda are, they're closer to parts of West Bengal. But most of it is much more like Burmese. So to a first approximation, you can say like Bengalis are a mixture of a population that looks very much like Biharis with a minor component that looks like Burmese. In northern parts of Bengal, like towards Darjeeling, like I have someone in Bangladesh who gave me a sample from like that area, and it looks like he's a little bit more Tibetan shifted. The problem with differentiating this is there's a language family called Tibeto-Burman, and the reason it's Tibeto and Burman is the Burmans originally they were from basically the eastern part of Tibet, western part of China, and they moved south and they mixed with indigenous rice farmers in that area. And so the Burmese themselves are a mixed population, so it's hard to differentiate, distinctive Tibetan signal from Burmese signal. But most of the ancestry, the vast majority of East Asian ancestry in Bengalis is Tibeto-Burman, probably Burmese. If you look at the Y chromosomes and the mitochondrial DNA, that looks similar too. The Munda people, I think the Santal, I think there's some of them in Bangladesh too. They're a separate admixture event of East Asians, of pure Austroasiatic people. Also, a difference is there are no mitochondrial DNA. There are no maternal lineages that are East Asian on the Munda, where Bangladeshis, where the Bengali samples I've seen, and also West Bengali samples, some of the Y chromosome and some of the mitochondrial are East Asian. So again, there were some women and there were some men that were integrated from these East Asian populations into a majority Indo-Aryan speaking population that looks quite similar to Bihari peasants. That's the way I would model it.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. So So one of the things that we mentioned that the lack of endogamy and lack of like a caste structure in Bengal and the admixture, Eastern admixture. So this is purely speculation and hypothetical, I know, but is there any kind of historical evidence that these two can be linked? That because the Eastern admixture happened and that changed the society a bit, and that subsequently there was it became less. Traditional or less like to the other part of South Asia.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, this is not something that I have like a very strong inference on, but it does look like West Bengal does have that endogamous structure. Uh, there hasn't been like a deep dive analysis of like the history of how and when that emerged that I can see in the papers that I saw, but basically, West Bengal is not that different from the rest of India. In that, like, their various like caste communities are distinctive. They look endogamous. I posted a paper that showed Bengalis and included a lot of Bangladeshis, and it's a genetic continuum when you look at genome wide comparisons between global continental populations. But when you look at runs of homozygosity and inbreeding, some of the West Bengali populations, some of the caste populations have spiked up runs of homozygosity, and that's indicating of endogamy driving genetic distinctiveness within these castes, right? So yeah, basically what I can say, I think with a high degree of confidence, is there was cultivator peasant population around 500 AD that mixed with Eastern Eurasians, probably Proto-Burmese. I think the Tibeto-Burmans were moving into actually Myanmar at that point, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was an expansion westward that was part of that, and then eventually it became Indo-Aryanized in speech. Although I've read that like some of the accents east of the Padma like do reflect like Tibeto-Burman influence. But in any case, so that happened, and then out of that, it looks like you have the various ethno-linguistic groups of the Assamese and the Bengal, those two, the Assamese and the Bengalis, and then we have the modern situation where it looks like Muslim Bengalis, at least in Bangladesh, I don't know what the samples in Western Bengal are like, do not have the sort of communal structure at all that you see in the Pakistan samples. Okay, which I think that kind of makes sense because like they don't have Birdari and they don't have clan structures, so that makes sense. But West Bengalis do have caste structure, and that's a fact. And also, Bengali Brahmins are quite distinct in that they have less East Asian ancestors. Like Bengali Brahmins look, whether they're Eastern or Western, they look like they're a mix of like standard North Indian Brahmins with a Bengali-like population. So they have East Asian admixture. So that's a sign that they have indigenous Bengali admixture. But it's like about like 75. I usually say about 75% North Indian Brahmin and 25% just generic Bengali, right? And so they are a distinct population. Whereas like other groups like Kayastas, we have some Kayas samples, and they look more like other Bengalis. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I mean that's what I've seen in the data. There is someone who's I think is clearly a half Brahmin, by the way, in the Bangladesh sample. But I usually discard that individual from analyses. No offense.
Anybody who's next? Any question? Hasim Bhai, you had a lot of questions.
I can shoot for a long time because I have two comments, Rajiv. One thing is that about 580 the Huns attacked North India, and that was the end of Guptas. So Huns being Huns, maybe a population migrated eastward. That has been the case even in the Sultani period. That whenever we were attacked, we always went in the hinterland in the east to hide. This is one comment. Another comment would be in the Sylheti population, there is some Dalit community. I mean, as you know, that in the tea gardens there are communities, but also there are local Dalit communities. So, and they have endogamy. I mean, not by choice, but because nobody marries them. Even they don't. Even now, they don't get any jobs. So maybe the exception that you mentioned can be that. But the big question that I want to ask you, the ANI and ASI, what would be a typical let's say center of Bangladesh, Dhaka, what would be the percentage of ANI, ASI, and East Asian on an average? So, what is an average Bangladeshi?
Well, so really quickly about the Huns, the East Asian ancestry in Bengalis is quite clearly has a lot of Southeast Asian component. So it doesn't look like it's a good fit for Central Asian. So as the Turco-Mongols and Turco, the Persianate whatever peoples had a lot of Turkic ancestry. That is found in some Ashraf Muslims. Like I have seen it myself. Like I have a friend who married a Pakistani woman who was part whatever Turkic, and it looks very distinctive. So it's not Turkic, whatever it is, mostly. I mean, I'm sure there's someone from Bangladesh who has like an Afghan grandfather or whatever, but it looks very Southeast Asian, right? So it's from like Burma or maybe like Arunachal Pradesh, like so that's that. And then the other question was what was the other question? What was the other question?
What is the mix of ANI,
Oh,
ASI?
okay, yeah. I'm gonna
yeah,
I'm gonna look this up. About it depends on the person. I usually say about like 10% East Asian, and then the rest of it I would split like 45-45, something like that. Maybe a little bit more ASI than ANI, but it's about 50-50.
So
I can go on. I mean, Bhaiya.
okay. Before that, can I ask a question? Yeah.
Well, I mean, really quickly, because I don't know if the people can see that. I don't think they can. They're not going to see this, but I am posting a couple of links just in the chat. If you look at some visualizations, like the second link, has like BAN is Bangladesh, and you can see right there that when you look at Bengalis from West Bengal to Bangladesh, like it recapitulates on the geography pretty well, right? And then there's like some of these there's like these other caste groups that are a little broken out. But anyway, go on.
Okay. So, Hasib bhai, you want to go, or Hasib bhai, do you want to go?
Okay, yes. So, the primary question that we face is who are the Adivasis of Bangladesh? And the idea is that, in Bangladesh, the Pahari people, they're called Adivasis. So, I mean, what would be your simple answer?
Wait. Did you say Bahari or Pahari? I don't.
Pahari, of people from the hill tracts. So this is a politically charged question. That Adivasi, in my view, that if the Adivasis are there, then the Bangladeshi Bengalis are settlers. Well, so we need to come to a sort of like an understanding of what is the political charge. And people think that, I'm a terrible person that I'm challenging the Adivasi concept but I think that, we cannot call somebody Adivasis when the other people, the otherness becomes settler. So in terms of the Chakma population, what is their origin? And what is
okay.
This Adivasi?
All right. So, I mean, I will say, these are really great questions. So, I mean, I'm willing to go really long. Just like, let's just answer all the questions because these are good questions. And, so I will say the whole idea of Adivasi is made up. It's fake. It's quite clearly fake. We had an understanding that maybe they were here first and all this stuff. If you read the books from like, I don't know, the 20th century, from the 1980s and 1980s, they're like, oh, these indigenous peoples were here. And then like, the Indo-Aryans came. Well, I mean, it looks like the Adivasis, mostly in the Indian subcontinent overall, like let's set aside Bangladesh, and we can get to that in a second. They're from the same original mix of ANI, ASI, and it's just they're socially marginalized, and so they were labeled as earlier. But the Munda people, I'm pretty sure, came actually after the Indo-Aryans. Their paternal lineage is very distinct. It's very, very related to Southeast Asian cultivators, and their Y chromosomes are very, very different from everybody else. and I'm pretty sure they brought the particular type of rice agriculture later. So even though they're Adivasis, their culture is totally alien, and it's actually more recent in the Indian subcontinent than the Indo-Aryan speakers and the Dravidian speakers, right? So it's actually just a false concept, even though it organizes social political discussion in the Indian subcontinent. Everybody is part Adivasi, and all the Adivasis are part non-Adivasi, because it's a continuum, and it's really distributed more on social marginalization and Sanskritization and integration into either the Islamic or the Hindu-Indic civilizational agricultural contexts, right? That's what I would say. When it comes to Eastern Bengal, this is like outside of my wheelhouse in terms of, I don't there are people. So the Eaton book, the Bengal Frontier, that book that we referenced, people read it, but there's not that much, work, at least in English, on this topic. And so, he gets a lot of, airtime. I don't know like how confident we should be about some of this stuff. But we have to go on him, and his argument, basically, to recapitulate, is a lot of Eastern Bengal was relatively lightly populated before the Mughals, and Islamic character is partly due to the Mughal sponsorship of settlement of Indo-Aryan speaking, of Bengali speaking peasants in this area, and that so that's that's that, right? With like the Chakma and these Pahari, I guess these hill tribe people, I mean, I definitely assume that they are within the last couple of thousand years, because so the Mon language in Burma is Austroasiatic. It's very, very distantly related to Cambodian and the languages that were in Thailand before the Thai arrived. So what happened in the last 2,000 years? More like, okay, so the Tibeto-Burmans might have arrived as early as like 1000 BC, but the Thai-speaking people arrived like after like 800, 900 AD. So there's been ethno-linguistic shift in Southeast Asia, and some of it seems to have spilled over into the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent, which these lines on maps are very new anyway, right? I think the Chakma, like these sorts of people, I know I've read that they've started shifting to Bengali, like their language, but their original language is Tibeto-Burman, right? So they're Tibeto-Burman, so that they're like they're more recent in Southeast Asia than the Indo-Aryans, for example, or the Indian subcontinent. I'm assuming that they are intrusive to that part of the subcontinent, but I don't know who could have been there earlier. Probably Austroasiatic speakers, like the people in Meghalaya. So the Meghalayan language is Austroasiatic, but it's very different and distinct from the Munda languages that are in, the Chotanagpur, highlands of Odisha and into West Bengal. And also it's very distinct from Mon and Cambodian. So there's like a whole group of Austroasiatic languages that disappeared with the expansion of Indo-Aryans from the west, and then also Tibeto-Burmans and Thai people from the north. And so what we're seeing is little relics and fragments of these and trying to reconstruct what was there. So probably it was an Austroasiatic speaking population that was in these hills before the arrival of the Chakma. Chakma probably integrated with them because, when you look at Burmese, their ancestry is a mix of like northern East Asian and southern East Asian. That's the way I can describe that. But also the Chakma and a lot of these hill tribes, they're obviously substantially East Asian, but they also have Indo-Aryan ancestry. They have conventional Indian subcontinental ancestry, and I'm pretty sure that's from Proto-Bengali speaking people that they intermarried with over time. And so if you look at the Kazai, who are the indigenous people of Meghalaya, and they speak an Austroasiatic language that's very distinct, and you take like Biharis and then you put Bengalis, and so across that you can see a line, and that indicates that the East Asian ancestry in Bengalis is very similar to the Kazai people, who have they now have Tibeto-Burman ancestry, but they also have a very distinct Austroasiatic ancestry from the Munda people, and they have subcontinental ancestry, like 25-30% is a common fraction, and that's similar to what you see in Bengal and Assam and obviously in Bihar, right? And so it's this mix of various peoples that have different fractions and different cultural and religious identities, and it's all kind of confused, right? So the Adivashi question is just, to me, like in the Indian subcontinent, it's a purely political question, and it's a political construct. The genetics has made it really clear that everyone has ancestry from a common ancestral population that mixed together, depending on which groups you're talking about, 2,000 to 6,000 years ago, right? So, yeah.
Can I ask a question now? Yeah. So Hasib bhai, let me ask a question. So there is a, you know that in Bangladesh, particularly among the Muslim people, those who are educated or upper class, there's like a distinct competition, or I would say the pride in declaring ancestry from Middle East or Iran or that part, like or Afghan, or say people saying that even Sheikh Hasina, well, she was famously her father was like said that her ancestors came from there, and all families, everybody mentions that. So my question is that among the Bangladeshi Muslim people, you said that we lack structure like others, but is there any different like class structure between those who are educated upper class elite? You come from a long line of alims that you mentioned sometimes that your family has been like educator and like that. So is there any class structure evident in the genetics, that signature that you see?
Mm.
That I heard that the upper class is a little bit different, and in the working class, the Bengali Hindus, Bangladeshi Hindus, and Bangladeshi Muslims looks all the same. But maybe is there any class structure that you have seen?
Yeah. I mean, like, it's kind of weird. Yeah, so my paternal grandfather, so as you guys know, because you're all Bengali, people have like Doc Nams and good names. My paternal grandfather didn't have a Doc Nam, and so his family, they only had Muslim names, because they wanted to set a good example, I guess. I don't know. All their descendants have Doc Nams now, so that was in vain. And so he was like very tall and very light skinned, and so people would say like, oh, well, he has like, foreign ancestry, whatever. But when I looked at my dad's genetic, I mean, basically my parents look like pretty generic Bengalis. And so that was like, it wasn't surprising, but like I did ask, because so my East Asian percentage, my parents East Asian, they're from Kumilla, which to the audience will mean that. So my mom's family is from Humna, and my dad's family is from like outside of Chandpur, right? So they're from like they're from like the eastern area, and if you on the 1,000 genomes on those Dhaka Bengalis, I'm like, my family is like, we're on the edge towards the eastern edge, but that's just like geography. What I've noticed is the further east you go, the more East Asian you have. But I don't see that much structure otherwise, aside from, in the tea garden hypothesis, those Dalits, that's what people have actually told me about the outliers, but everybody else looks very similar. I've had a couple of Bengalis, not too many, but I've had a couple of people, Bangladesh samples, that look like they have detectable West Asian ancestry, a couple of them. But it's not very common. Now, the issue is like, I don't know if you guys know this, but all of the richest families in Virginia, there's something called like the first families of Virginia, and they go back to the 1630s, and they were like landowners. All of those families have a line of descent from Pocahontas, who's like, Native American, whatever. She's her through her son, John Rolfe. Anyway, but like most of them don't have any Native American ancestry, because after 8 generations, you only have a 50% chance of having ancestry from any given individual. So what I would say is like, I think it's quite plausible that a lot of elite, Muslim Bengali families have a line of genealogy to someone who is part of like, the Persianate cultural complex. And we know historically that some of these families spoke Urdu, and, I've heard that some of my, paternal grandfather's ancestors were Urdu speaking, like, they were like totally Bengali by his generation. And so, but like the issue here is like, it could have been that they were originally Bengali speaking and they switched to Urdu because that was a prestigious language. And then they switched back to Bengali again when there was no social advantage to Urdu. This, just by analogy, this happened in Finland, where elite Finnish speaking families, once they became elite, they would drop Finnish and they switched to Swedish, and they made their names totally Swedish. And then in the 19th century, when Finnish nationalism arose, they switched their names back to Finnish. But they were seen as totally Swedish, and a lot of the Finns were just like, you're not real Finnish. But when you look at the genealogies, they switched their names 200 years ago. So if you look at their genetics, they would look just like the other Finns, but culturally they have a long history of being Swedish speaking. Anyway, my point is like this sort of stuff is complicated. I haven't seen too much. I guess what I would say is when I first saw the results from my family and the 1,000 genomes Bangladeshis, it's just like, yeah, I hear a lot of Bangladeshis talk about like, connections to, I have an Iranian friend, and he told me that like, I'm not going to say like what his perception of this was, but like he was in some like a Muslim student association at Berkeley, and like some Bangladeshi girl was like, yeah, like our common Iranian civilization. And he was just like, what are you talking about? But a lot of Bangladeshis talk like that. Well, I mean, genetically though, there's, not really a basis for that. I mean, culturally is different. And this event 500 AD that happened 1500 years ago, that's really what's like a huge genetic impact. Actually, 15%, in me, or 10% in someone from, Dhaka area, even 5% in, in Kolkata and that area. This is like a substantial thing that happened, and nobody really understands what it is. So I don't know. Maybe someday we'll find some texts or what. There's issues with textual preservation, as you guys know, of Indian records. But it's an interesting juxtaposition. But also, in Southeast Asia itself, like it's quite clear now from the genetics that there was an ancient migratory wave that is strongly correlated with the emergence of Hindu and Buddhist civilization in that region that dates to well before the colonial period. And mostly it's remembered as legends now. And what historians and anthropologists assumed is like, oh, these are just legends to tie these like converted like Buddhist and Hindu kings to India. But now, like, we have DNA from 800 AD in Cambodia of someone that's clearly half Cambodian, half Indian. And if you look at in Thailand and in Cambodia, there's a lot of like low-level evidence of Indian admixture. So, for example, the Y chromosome R1A, which is connected to steppe peoples, is found in about like 3 to 4% of Cambodian men, right? So that is clearly connected to an Indian migratory wave, even though culturally its only remnant is now the religion, right? Like ethno-linguistically, they've totally been absorbed, and Cambodians don't remember really, and Indians have no record of this. So there's a lot of things that seem to have happened in history that we just have no recollection of for whatever reason.
Shafiq, you're muted.
Sorry.
I guess I'll take advantage of this confusion to ask a question. I mean, like this is kind of like based off of like the last two answers you gave, both about like the elite Muslims and like the hill tracts people. I guess like, do we have like enough samples from like Bangladesh to kind of like answer these questions? I mean, you kind of alluded to like the 1,000 Genomes Project, and I understand there were like older HAP map sort of data. But I mean, where's this? Do we have like sampling from like the hill tracts region, for instance? I guess
we have better. We have better provenance, much better provenance on the hill tracts region because anthropologists are actually interested in them. So like we have like really bad provenance. So basically, like labels are super important, obviously, in population genetics. Although you can, because of endogamy in the Indian subcontinent, I can identify someone pretty easily a lot of the time. The hill tracts people, like these Tibeto-Burmans, like there's more papers on them in terms of anthropological genetics than there are on Bangladeshis themselves, because they're more interesting to anthropologists. Where Bangladeshis, there's more like medical genetics. So we haven't talked about like the biological adaptation, but the reason the East Asian admixture first came out was in a paper on cholera adaptation. So it looks like Bangladeshis have cholera adaptation, right? Because of like diseases, right? And so medical genetics has explored Bangladeshis a lot. But like historical population genetics has not really explored Bangladeshis a lot, partly because there's not like, it doesn't look like there's detailed caste structure. Also, I mean, I don't really know that. I mean, honestly, how do I say this? My personal experience is like, people from India, and Hindus like care a lot about the details of their ancestry, and Muslims just from the Indian subcontinent do not, unless they're like Sayyids or something, and then sometimes the results are quite awkward and we stop talking. So like I have a. I hope he's not listening to this because like his family doesn't want to know this, but I have a Sayyid friend who like sent me his data, and I'm like, oh well, you have some West Asian ancestry, but your Y chromosome's R1A, and you look like you're half Brahmin. And he's like, that doesn't make sense. That's not right. And I'm like, wow, that's what the genetics say. And it's quite clear that his Sayyid ancestry are actually just Brahmins that converted to Islam and were given that title. So didn't really want to hear that. He didn't tell his family.
Okay, let me have a go regarding Adivasi thing. The Denisovan and our Neanderthal. So are we different from the other part of the world? Because I heard that our Denisovan gene is, more than our Western.
Well, no, I mean, so this is actually interesting, complicated. The Neanderthal stuff is kind of well understood, pretty well understood. So everybody in the world who has Neanderthal admixture today, and so this is not true in the past, but that's because some populations went extinct. Everybody in the world who has Neanderthal ancestry today, which is almost everybody, even in Africa, because people in Africa have like Eurasian ancestry that came in. But let's focus mostly on outside of Africa. That comes from a single admixture event, probably happened somewhere in Iran or Anatolia or Central Asia, with the early expanding, modern humans. Okay, that this is about like 50,000 years ago, somewhere between 45 and 50,000 years ago, closer to 50,000 years ago. It looks like a Neanderthal tribe somehow was absorbed into the expanding modern humans and mixed into the modern humans, so that, just like I say, I can identify that someone is Northeast Indian subcontinental just by the fact that they have East Asian ancestry, because those are the only populations that do, unless you're a Munda tribal person, okay? Because some of those went as far south as Andhra Pradesh, but that's clearly a hallmark of that one admixture that's swept through all the population. The Neanderthal ancestry is from that one tribe, and it's through every single human population, because, at that time, there were only like 1,000 of us. And, everybody, all the billions are descended from that 1,000, right? The Denisovan is a much different issue. So Denisovan ancestry is about like 3.5–4% now, the latest estimates based on the newest reference populations and whatnot. And people in Papua New Guinea, it's much lower elsewhere, aside from Australian Aborigines. Like Melanesia, like Australo-Melanesians have a high fraction, right? Everybody else is like about 10% of that. And so East Asians, like, Chinese, Han Chinese, they're like, say, 0.2, maybe 0.15%. And then, in some Southeast Asians, it's 0.2, 0.25. In some South Asians, it's, 0.25, 0.2. It's higher, a little bit higher, right? And it's not present at all in West Eurasians, which makes sense because it doesn't look like they existed in Western Eurasia at all. That's where the Neanderthals were. The key difference, though, is I told you the Neanderthals' ancestry is just one population. It's quite clear that at minimum, the Denisovan ancestry is from different Denisovan populations. So the samples that we have, the whole genomes, they're all from Mongolia. They're all from around Denisova Cave in the Altai, and that's a very distinct Denisovan population from the one that contributed ancestry into Papua New Guinea. And it's distinct, like Africans are distinct from Chinese. Like they were like in fact, greater than that. They might have split apart as like 400,000 years ago. Geographically distinct populations that were differently breeding populations. So what you had happen was modern humans expand across Eastern Eurasia. In the Northeast, they mix with these like Mongolian Denisovan types. And in Southeast Asia, perhaps in Papua even, they mixed with Denisovan that are indigenous to that region. But that's the minimum. It looks actually much more likely that there were at least 3 or even 4 admixture events. So one is in Northeast Asia that we know about. One is in Papua. The other 2, one of them looks like it happened either in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, or Southeast Asia. And that admixture is actually found in the Papuans as well. So the Papuans have like 2 to 3 admixture events, probably at least 2. And so one of them happened early with the Denisovan population that was in Southeast Asia. And that admixture event looks like it's probably in East Asians too. Okay. So what happened here is we have a model of, okay, there's an early South Asian admixture, and then they spread eastward, and there's an admixture in Southeast Asia that creates the Papuan cluster, and admixture in East Asia that creates the East Asian cluster. So you got 2 in both, but they're different. The second one is different. In South Asia, it looks like there was another admixture on top of the earlier one that happened. So either multiple South Asian Denisovan populations or the same Denisovan population, but there was an early admixture and a later admixture. The point is, there looks to be, and this is like, I'm going to give it like a 75% confidence, because like we don't have any ancient Denisovan DNA except for the Mongolian one. So we're trying to do inference here, right? It's an inference game, but we have a lot of DNA now. From like modern populations, and like you look at the relatedness of the Denisovan segments, it looks like there was an indigenous Denisovan population in South Asia that contributed uniquely to Indian subcontinental people. Now it's a small fraction. It's like 0.1 in Pakistan to like 0.25 in the northeast of the subcontinent, right? And it's small, but like it's distinct and it's different. And so that indicates like the deep roots of humans in the subcontinent. And so that's pretty interesting. And I think like there's some like immune adaptation that might be from the subcontinental Denisovans. I think that's interesting to a lot of people, right? Does that answer your question?
Oh, it does.
Yeah, I had a quick follow-up on that actually. So if I understand you correctly, like going off of the idea that there were like this indigenous Denisovan population in this part of the world, I mean, did the modern humans, like the currently living modern humans in this part of the world, have like two pulses of Neanderthal like contributions, or do we
Not
just
Neanderthal, but Denisovan.
sorry,
They
Denisovan
definitely did.
contributions, or just with the one?
Yeah, that again, like I'm gonna give this a 75% confidence for South Asians, but it looks like there's the statistics. I mean, as you know, it can be pretty abstruse.
Yeah.
But basically, it looks like there's a pan-East Eurasian pulse that everybody has,
Hmm.
probably from a South Asian Denisovan. Then there's unique later pulses from other Denisovans that make
That's
it distinctive from the
crazy.
different East. And one of them looks like it's in South Asia. And like the Indian subcontinent is big. Like you can imagine that there was like a northern population that mixed that, with everyone coming out of Africa to the east. It's called the initial Upper Paleolithic culture. That's what really expanded like 45 to 50,000 years ago. And then later, there was an admixture in the southern part of the Indian subcontinent, possibly with another Denisovan population, which could have been very distinct, because it looks like the gene flow was really minimal across these Denisovan populations. We know in the Papuans have at least 2 to 3,
Hmm.
at least 2, possibly 3, right? It looks like there might have been a different. Okay, this is like outside the purview of this conversation. It looks like there's a different Denisovan population in the Philippines that mixed with indigenous, like Negrito Filipino ancestries, right? So there's a lot of different types of Denisovans, only one type of Neanderthal that mixed with us, it looks like that part of this is due to the fact that like the first settlers of Europe and Siberia seem to have like gone extinct. Those people actually had the later Neanderthal admixture from those regions, but they went extinct. And so everything in Europe and Central Asia is from the Middle Eastern Neanderthal. So looks like there's 2 out of West Asian migrations. One is the initial Upper Paleolithic, and that expanded everywhere, like Europe, Siberia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. Then there was a second migration 37,000 years ago, out of, say, like northern Iran, probably. And that is the dominant genetic signal in Western Eurasians. And so that's about like half the signal in subcontinental